All right, welcome back, everyone. Thank you to those of us who are just joining. My name is Michael Fraud. I am the Assistant Program Director at Drisha. Very excited to have everyone here for the second class of our two-class Yom Iyun, our pre-Pesach learning together. So we are going to be continuing. We just had our great first session with Dr. Furstenberg on the structure of the Seder and the Greco-Roman Symposium. And we are going to now continue with remembering the Korban Pesach in Masechet Pesachim and in ancient Jewish sources with Yedidah Koren. Yedidah Koren is currently completing her PhD on Mamzerim and lineage in rabbinic literature at Tel Aviv University. She's taught at Drisha, Yeshivat Hadar, Bar Ilan University, and at the Paideia Institute in Stockholm, as well as studying at Drisha, Matan, Migdal Oz, and Midresha Lindenbaum. She holds a BA in Talmud and Classics from the Hebrew University and is also a fellow of the Maskilot program at the Hartman Institute in Jerusalem. For this class, remembering the Korban Pesach in Masechet Pesachim and in ancient Jewish sources, we are going to think about the ways in which the Seder night is intended as remembering and reenacting the Korban Pesach, the Pesach sacrifice, and the ways in which the Korban Pesach itself was intended to reenact the first Pesach offering that was celebrated in Egypt. Alongside sources from Masechet Pesachim, we are going to be looking at additional ancient Jewish sources that reminisce about this offering, but in a variety of very different ways. With that, I think we can get started.
Great. Hi, everyone. It's very exciting to be here. I'm also joining you from Jerusalem. And it's very exciting to be able to teach at Drisha from Jerusalem. Thank you, Michael. And I just want to say, I don't know if it got to you, but I sent a link for the source sheet to Michael, and hopefully he can share it with you so that you can flip through the source sheet and study the sources while I'm talking and not only when I share my screen. Okay, so this is a wonderful opportunity to take advantage also of the Siyum of Masechet Pesachim, and that this is happening several days before Pesach, to think both about memory in Masechet Pesachim and memory in Leil Seder. And this connects with, I was happy that Neil Nachum asked his question. It connects with what he was talking about. What is the story that we're telling? What is the memory that we're remembering when we are having Leil Seder? So I'm going to start off with the first source. Wait, let me share my screen. Is from Sefer Shmot, and it really is the beginning of when we even hear about Pesach. The Torah says, והיה היום הזה לכם לזיכרון, וחגותם אותו חג להשם לדורותיכם, חוקת עולם תחגו. Pesach is a day of memory. What are we remembering on Pesach? What are we remembering on Leil Seder? So the simplest, most straightforward answer is, of course, Yetziat Mitzrayim. What else can we be remembering on Pesach? But what I want to show today is that in addition to remembering Yetziat Mitzrayim, there are a lot of sources in Masechet Pesachim, in Masechet Pesachim itself, that show how Pesach and Leil Seder is also about remembering the temple. And there's a lot of tension with remembering the temple, because there's a fine line, especially on Leil Seder, between remembering and reenacting. And when is a memory too close to the thing itself? And when we cross the line between remembering and reenacting, when it comes to the temple, then we go too far. So we're going to be thinking about what we're supposed to be remembering on Leil Seder. How do we remember? What's the difference between memory and reenacting? What is the tension between Yetziat Mitzrayim and the Korban Pesach from the Mikdash? What is their presence in our Leil Seder? And in the end, we're going to have a little bit of time to see two other different kinds of models thinking about Leil Seder that are not about memory. So let's glance through several of these sources that show really straightforwardly that, first of all, Pesach is about remembering Yetziat Mitzrayim. So the second piece of sources that I brought from Shmot Yud Bet are an answer that a father says to their, that people are supposed to tell their sons when they ask them about the Korban Pesach generations later. ושמרתם את הדבר הזה לחוק לך ולבניך עד עולם, והיה כי תבואו אל הארץ אשר ייתן השם לכם כאשר דיבר, ושמרתם את העבודה הזאת. והיה כי יאמרו עליכם בניכם, when your sons ask you, מה העבודה הזאת לכם? What is this that you're doing? What is this ritual? What is this rite? ואמרתם, זבח פסח הוא להשם, אשר פסח על בתי בני ישראל במצרים, ונוקפו את מצרים, ואת בתינו הציל, ויקוד העם וישתחוו. So Pesach is about remembering that God spared the houses of Israel when he smote the Egyptians. And the same thing is in Sefer Dvarim, when it commands the mitzvah of also of Korban Pesach and Chag HaMatzot, למען תזכור את יום צאתך מארץ מצרים כל ימי חייך. So this holiday is about remembering Yetziat Mitzrayim. This is what this holiday is about. What's fascinating is when we've glanced through Masechet Pesachim, and when we study Masechet Pesachim for several months, nearing up to Pesach, Yetziat Mitzrayim has very little space in Masechet Pesachim, and instead, a very large portion of Masechet Pesachim is all about the Mikdash. And it's especially about remembering what used to be in the Mikdash and no longer is. The Mishnah is redacted in the 2nd century. This is after Churban HaBayit, and there are 5 chapters in Masechet Pesachim that consists of 10 chapters. Half of Masechet Pesachim is about the Korban Pesach. So part of it is a description, I'll read it shortly, of how Korban Pesach was done in the Mikdash. And other parts are about how you're supposed to roast the Korban Pesach, how you're supposed to eat it with a certain group, what kind of intention does one need to have when slaughtering the Korban Pesach. Many, many rules about Korban Pesach and Pesach Sheni. All of this is not part of the reality of the Tanaim, but it's important for them, and this is part of a larger, broader project in the Mishnah, that in general, large proportions of the Mishnah are about remembering the Mikdash. But in this case, it's especially striking because Masechet Pesachim, right, which is Pesach, is really all about remembering Yetziat Mitzrayim. Suddenly Masechet Pesachim, and when we learn the Mishnah, and especially when we learn the Bavli, so much about it is remembering the Mikdash, and it's not about remembering Yetziat Mitzrayim. So I'm gonna read quickly just a little bit of this source. The Paschal Lamb was slaughtered in 3 groups. It is stated in the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall slaughter in the afternoon. Assembly, congregation, and Israel. These are the 3 groups. The first group entered, and the temple courtyard became filled. They closed the doors of the temple courtyard. They blasted, Tkiah, Tuah, and Tkiah. The priests stood in rows and rows, and their hands were filled with bowls of silver and bowls of gold. The row entirely of silver was silver. The row entirely of gold was gold, and they were not mixed. and the bulls did not have bases, lest they set them down and the blood would congeal. So this is one piece out of a description of how exactly the Korban Pesach was happening, and this is very theatrical. Whether or not this is historically or not historically accurate, it's not exactly historically accurate, based on other sources that we have from the time of the temple, but nonetheless, what's important here is that the Mishnah is devoted and dedicated to remembering the Korban Pesach, not the Korban Pesach of Pesach Mitzrayim, but the Korban Pesach of the Mikdash. And there is one Mishnah in the Masechet that says something about Pesach Mitzrayim. And this is just a Mishnah that is following a Mishnah about Pesach Sheni. In the 9th chapter, the 3rd Mishnah talks about the differences between Pesach Rishon and Pesach Sheni, and then 2 Mishnayot afterwards, Ma ben Pesach Mitzrayim le Pesach Dorot. So Pesach Mitzrayim, Pesach Dorot, what is really the difference between them? And there are certain rules that make them different. Pesach Mitzrayim יקחו מבשר וטעון הזיה ואגודת אזוב על המשקוף ועל שתי המזוזות ונאכל בחיפזון לילה אחד. ופסח דורות נוהג כל 7. So Pesach Mitzrayim, there are these special rules. It has to be taken from Yud Ben Nisan. You have to sprinkle the blood, and you have to eat it quickly in one night. And Pesach Dorot, this is not the Korban Pesach, this is just in general the holiday itself. It lasts for 7 days. This is what the Mishnah has about Pesach Mitzrayim. And also the Bavli, it could have a long Agadata about Yetziat Mitzrayim, like for example, Masechet Megillah in the Bavli has a very long Agadata about Megillat Esther. But there isn't a very long Agadata about Yetziat Mitzrayim. There are pages and pages and pages about Kavanah and Korban Pesach. So the overlap between Masechet Pesachim and Leil Seder is the 10th chapter. And in the 10th chapter, we see that there is presence for remembering Yetziat Mitzrayim, obviously. For example, Rabban Gamliel says there are 3 things that you need to say, and the reasons for this are because we need to remember Pesach al Shem shepasach hamakom al batei avotenu b'Mitzrayim. Maror, of course, is because the Egyptians embittered our lives, and also in the Gemara, there's discussion about, for example, the charoset. Why do we need charoset? Charoset is in memory of the teat, of the mortar, or in memory of the apple tree, that there's an Agadah that's connected to the enslavement of the Israelites in Egypt. So elements of our Leil Seder are connected to remembering Yetziat Mitzrayim and telling the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim. And this is manifest also in the food that we eat and in the things that we say. But in parallel to that, the place of the Mikdash is also surprisingly prominent in Leil Seder. So this is an interesting parallel to a text that, if we remember the Haggadah, every year I need to refresh my memory, so some of you might also, but this might strike a similar chord, but it's not about Yetziat Mitzrayim. The Tosefta says, חייב אדם לעסוק בהלכות הפסח כל הלילה. הלכות הפסח is the Korban Pesach, right? A person needs to engage with learning the laws of the Paschal sacrifice all night. That's what one needs to do. אפילו בינו לבין בנו, אפילו בינו לבין עצמו, אפילו בינו לבין תלמידו. מעשה ברבן גמליאל וזקנים, שהיו מסובין בבית בטוס בן זונין בלוד, והיו עסוקים בהלכות הפסח כל הלילה, עד קרות הגבר. הגביהו מלפניהן ונועדו והלכו להן לבית המדרש. So this is very similar to what we know about how one must engage in the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim all night, but instead of telling us that we need to engage in the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim, the Tosefta is saying that we need to talk about the laws of Korban Pesach. So even though this we don't do, we have an alternative, right? Instead of discussing Korban Pesach all night, we discuss Yetziat Mitzrayim all night, and our ethos is that we have to discuss Yetziat Mitzrayim all night. But still, there are elements in our Leil HaSeder that are about remembering the Mikdash. For example, Korech, Zecher LaMikdash Ke'ilel. This appears in the Gemara. It was very helpful as I was preparing for this shiur. Every time I learned another daf, then there was another source that was helpful for this. There's a discussion how you're supposed to eat the matzah and the maror, if you're supposed to eat them together, if you're supposed to eat them separate. And Hillel would eat them all together. And what the Gemara says is that what we do now, what we're supposed to do, because it's not clear if you should eat them separately or not, we eat them, we make a bracha for each one and eat them separately, and then we eat them together. Zecher LaMikdash Kehillel. And Hillel would, of course, put the Korban Pesach in with it. We just eat the matzah and the maror and remember the Mikdash. And the food that we eat, just as the food that we eat, for example, the charoset, the maror, remind us of Yetziat Mitzrayim. The food that we eat, according to Amoraim, reminds us of Korban Pesach. Today, it's a later development from the Middle Ages, when exactly we started having the zroa and the beitzah for Korban Pesach and Korban Chagiga. But there is a discussion in the Gemara about the food that one needs to have on his plate on Leil HaSeder. And in the discussion, Rav Yosef says, צריך שני מיני בשר, אחד זכר לפסח ואחד זכר לחגיגה. So while we're remembering Yetziat Mitzrayim, we're also remembering Pesach, Korban Pesach, and Korban Chagiga. Using meat to remember the Korban Pesach is where really the memory and the reenactment become too close. So there's a discussion that comes up every so often in the Gemara, and it also appears elsewhere, which is connected to a very interesting practice, which is eating gdi mekulas, eating a whole roasted kid or a whole roasted lamb on Leil HaSeder. So let's see some of the sources. What is the problem with eating a whole roasted lamb on Leil HaSeder? The problem is that this might be a little too similar to the Korban Pesach itself, which was a whole roasted lamb or a whole roasted kid. So there was a debate whether or not it was permitted to observe this practice of eating a whole roasted lamb. In Mishnah Beitzah, there are three things that Rabban Gamliel is machmir about them, and then there are three things that he is mekel about them, and this is given as one of the things that he's mekel about. The third one is v'osin gdei mekulas beleilei pesachim v'chachamim osrim. So Rabban Gamliel allows this practice of the gdi mekulas, of eating a whole roasted kid on the eves of Passover, and Chachamim prohibit. And I'm going to skip the Tosefta, the beginning of the Tosefta. This custom, it's interesting to think about the history of it. It seems that it existed in distant communities, not necessarily only in rabbinic circles, or maybe not at all in rabbinic circles, but only in other communities. There is this testimony of Rabbi Yosei in Tosefta Chagiga. תוספת הביצה, תודוס איש רומי, הנהיג את בני רומי, לקח טלאים בלילי פסחים, ועושין אותן מקולסים. So there was a great man of Rome, a prominent Jew of Rome, Theodos of Rome, who instituted the custom for the Jews of Rome that they would take a whole lamb and roast it on the eves of Passover. And the rabbis, the sages said to him, אמרו לו, אף הוא קרוב להאכיל קודשים בחוץ, מפני שקוראים אותן פסחים. So it's getting too close. You're crossing the line between remembering and reenacting the Korban Pesach. And we can't go that far to roast a whole kid. Because it looks almost as if we're really eating korban outside of the mikdash. And here also there's this interesting tension, because really the Korban Pesach itself in the mikdash is remembering the whole roasted lamb from Yetziat Mitzrayim. So when the people of Rome, the Jews of Rome, or the house of Rabban Gamliel, perhaps, are eating this whole roasted lamb, are they trying to remember the Korban Pesach from the Mikdash? Are they trying to remember Yetziat Mitzrayim? Is it both? What exactly is going on? Interestingly, even if the whole roasted lamb was not something that was something that was a little too, it was too much, but the Mishnah does allow for eating roasted meat there, and says that there was a custom. Forget about the whole roasted lamb, that's a little too much, but there was in Mishnah Pesachim, in the 4th chapter, it says that in a place that where people are accustomed to eat roasted meat on the eves of Pesach, you can eat roasted meat on the eves of Pesach. On a place where they were not accustomed to eat roasted meat, probably it was too much, too close to the Korban itself, then they didn't eat this. Then you shouldn't eat this. You shouldn't eat roasted meat on Pesach. And this isn't a whole kid. This is just plain old roasted meat. And still, we see this tension. There are certain places, there are certain customs of eating it, and others that are not. And really, we find this also in the Arba Kushiyot of the Mishnah. In the Arba really, there are 3 in the Mishnah, but sorry, in the Kushiyot of the Mishnah, one of the questions, we don't ask this anymore, is שבכל הלילות אנו אוכלים בשר צלי, שלוק ומבושל. הלילה הזה כולו צלי. So the kushiyot of the Mishnah reflect this practice. This is after the Churban, and still Leil Seder is special in eating roasted meat, and this is also in memory of Yetziat Mitzrayim, but also reminds us of the Korban Pesach. And that's why in the Gemara, when we say, Rava says, when we say Pesach, Matzah, Umaror, we do not raise the meat. And this is always a thing that we need to remember every year in my family on Leil Seder. When we raise the 3 things, or we point to the 3 things when we recite Rabban Gamliel Omer, Pesach, Matzah, Umaror, you are not supposed to point to the Zroa when you're saying Pesach, because it's not Pesach and it's getting too close if we say that it is. This really is a tension of trying to remember the Mikdash. And also, what is the place of the Mikdash in our Pesach today? When we are now, or we or the Chachamim are not so different from us, even though hundreds of years separate us. they are after the Korban, we are after the Korban. Are we now still only remembering Yetziat Mitzrayim, or are we also trying to remember something additional? And this tension arises in the machloket between Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Akiva of how we say the bracha of the Geula in the closing part of Magid. What do we say? So Rabbi Tarfon says, אשר גאלנו וגאל את אבותינו ממצרים והגיענו הלילה הזה ואינו חותם. So the language of the bracha is, we were redeemed, our fathers were redeemed from Egypt, and we arrived at this night. This is what Leil Seder is about. It's about redemption from Egypt, and that's it. And we got to this night, and we were redeemed from Egypt. And we're only looking back to our redemption from Egypt. And we're, in a sense, ignoring the chapter of the temple in between. But Rabbi Akiva says, Rabbi Akiva Omer, he adds, we have to add to this bracha, and this is what we say, כן השם אלוהינו ואלוהי אבותינו, יגיענו לרגלים הבאים לקראתנו לשלום, שמחים בבניין עולם, לאכול מן הפסחים ומן הזבחים, אשר יגיע דמם על קיר מזבחך לרצון, ונודה לך על גאולתנו. ברוך אתה השם, גואל או גאל ישראל. So, and this is what we say today, right? We don't only thank God for taking us out of Egypt. Leil Seder is not only today about leaving Egypt, says Rabbi Akiva, but we're also making the Mikdash present in our Leil Seder, and we're making its absence present. And the Geula is no longer only about Yetziat Mitzrayim. The Geula also on Pesach is about the Mikdash as well. We have to, while we're thanking God for taking us out of Egypt, we're acknowledging that we're also waiting for a time when we can again have the Pesachim and the Zvachim, right? We can eat the Pesach sacrifice. And that our Leil Seder is not full without the Korban Pesach. I'm going to pause here before I go to the other sources, because they're going to take us to a different direction in case people have questions.
I have just a quick question. It's just, I didn't quite understand, maybe it's not something you would answer, but that it says that Hillel, Zecher, he ate the three things together. Well, of course he ate the three things together. That's what the Torah says to do. Why is it specifically in remembrance of Hillel?
So for the Amoraim in the Gemara, you're right. I mean, first of all, you're right. That's what the Torah says. Al matzot u'marorim yochlu. However, for the Amoraim in the Gemara, because this becomes sort of each one becomes a halachic mitzvah. So the question is, if we eat matzah and maror together, do they cancel each other out? Can we, if we can't taste each one on itself by itself, maybe we're not fulfilling our chiyuv. So this is this is an interesting way of thinking about a sort of an eating practice. And perhaps it also shows how far it was from the actual celebration of the meat and the matzah and the maror and eating it together as a sandwich. So it became just remembering like Hillel did in the mikdash. From an ancient Jewish source that dates way before the time of the Tanaim to sometime in the 2nd century BC, called the Book of Jubilees. The Book of Jubilees was written as what's called a rewritten Bible. It retells the story of from the creation with all sorts of twists and turns and embellishments and changes to the story itself. But it's told as Torah. It's told as the framework for the book is Moshe going up to the Har Sinai and the angel of the presence telling him all the Torah. And in Sefer HaYovlim, the mitzvah of Pesach is slightly different from the mitzvah of Pesach that we know it, that's in the Torah, or that is that we know from Sifrut Chazal. So it's very interesting to compare what Pesach was in ancient Judaism during the time of the Second Temple itself. What was Pesach for other kinds of Jews, other groups of Jews. So for example, in Sefer HaYovlim, it's in the part that I brought for you, but it's in the small letter, in the small font. Pesach can only be celebrated by men who are above age 20. It's not a family affair. It's for men who are above age 20 who go to the temple and do this as sort of a right. It shouldn't be given to children or women, chas v'chalila, in their eyes, of course. So Pesach for them is also a Yom Zikaron, but it's a very different kind of Yom Zikaron. So I'm going to read only the large font. ואתה צב את בני ישראל ויעשו את הפסח בדורותם בכל שנה, פעם בשנה, ביום מועדו, ויבוא זיכרון מלפני אלוהים לרצון. ולא יבוא עליהם משחית, לחלות ולהכות בשנה ההיא, בעת אשר יעשו את הפסח במועדו, על פי כל מצוותו. So, read the English.
Hebrew, right?
It was a great question. It was originally written in Hebrew, but we don't have the Hebrew original. It was from Hebrew translated into Greek, and we don't have much of that either. From Greek, it was translated into ancient Ethiopian, and that is what we have.
So this is a kind of second-rate reconstruction, this language.
Yes, but we do have small pieces in Hebrew that were found in Qumran, in the caves of Qumran, from a little bit after the time that the book was composed. So we know that it existed in Hebrew. And we have small parts of it. And from this style is this reconstruction.
It's a modern scholarly reconstruction?
Yeah. Yes. It was translated. This translation that I brought to you in Hebrew is, you can see in the footnote, by Kana Verdman. The English is by James Vanderkam. So I'll read the English because the Hebrew might, we need to sort of digest what's going on. Now you order the Israelites to celebrate the Passover each year during their generations, once a year on a specific day. Then a pleasing memorial will come before the Lord, and no plague will come upon them to kill and strike them during that year when they have celebrated the Passover at its time, in every respect as it was commanded. So what is the Korban Pesach for Jubilees? What is the memory for Jubilees? When we read in Sefer Shmot, v'chagotem oto lezikaron, it's not at all about historic memory. The memory is that God is remembering us every single year. Only if we do the Korban Pesach properly. So if Bnei Israel do the Korban Pesach properly, that specific year, they will not have a plague. They will not have destruction. And this needs to be done every single year for the protection of the entire year that comes, that follows. So first of all, this sounds very similar to how we think about Rosh Hashanah. This is the Rosh Rishon hu lachem lechodshei hashana. They take this seriously. Pesach is, in a sense, this holiday of the beginning of a year. And because it's a holiday of the beginning of the year, the way that Korban Pesach is celebrated will determine whether Bnei Israel will be protected for that year. In this framing, the Korban Pesach is not about remembering Yetziat Mitzrayim. Jubilees tells about the first Korban Pesach that happened in Mitzrayim, but this was a first of many that are exactly of its kind. Just as the first Korban Pesach was meant to protect Bnei Israel in Mitzrayim, so too, every single year, Korban Pesach needs to happen in order to protect Bnei Israel every single year. It's, in a sense, it's very strong, because to them, it's not enough. It's not enough to have an entire holiday that's all about an entire sacrifice. Think about it. It's a sacrifice, an entire sacrifice that has no significance of its own, except for the fact that it's in order to remember something that happened, right? That's in our narrative, in the rabbinic narrative, in the biblical narrative. The only reason we celebrate Korban Pesach is to remember an event that happened many, many years ago. For Yovlim, the Korban Pesach, in a sense, is real. It's real every single year. It's doing the protective work that it did the first time. It's doing every single year since. And that's why we need to bring it. It's a much stronger incentive to do the Korban Pesach, because every year we're going to need this protection. And then the historical aspect of Pesach kind of disappears. So if I'm going to move on to the last source, but if anyone has questions about Sefer HaYovlim, now is the time.
Can I ask you a question? It sounds to me like an amulet or something to do with magic.
Yeah.
So, am I right? And does Sefer HaYovlim have more of this kind of magic?
Yes. So clear. Yes, definitely. And you're right with your intuition. A lot of Sefer HaYovlim, when it talks about certain mitzvot, for example, Brit Milah, which is also very similar to Pesach, it's very much about has a protective element to it. And the mashchit, the destructor, is very present in its worldview. These are ideas that also exist. We can find them hinted here and there in Sifrut Chazal also, but in Yovlim it's explicit, and that's what a lot of is about. Yeah.
To which century is the book attributed?
The late 2nd century BC.
Thank you.
Any more questions? Okay. So our final source that I am excited to bring, Va'amartem Zevach Pesach. So this is a piyut that I have never said, or maybe when I was very young. My family made Aliyah when I was 6 years old. So I have celebrated only one day of Pesach since. It's a piyut that I know only from the page that we skip in the Haggadah, but it's a fascinating piyut. What the piyut is about, let's say a few words about the piyut. The piyut Va'amartem Zevach Pesach was written by Rabbi Eliezer Akalir in the land of Israel sometime around the 6th century. And originally it was not a piyut for Leil Seder, it was a piyut for Shacharit of Pesach, but it was taken in the Middle Ages and put in the Haggadah, in the parts of Nirtzah that are after the core part of Leil Seder. And what the piyut is building off of an idea that already happens in its twin piyut, Vayi b'chatzi halayla, in that it points to all sorts of biblical moments and events as happening on Pesach. So Vayi b'chatzi halayla points to all sorts of biblical events that happened on, according to tradition, Yudaled b'Nisan. But this piyut takes it one step further, V'amartem zevach Pesach, and it's based on traditions in Midrashim. Not only did these events happen on that specific date, but Pesach as a holiday was celebrated by biblical figures way before Bnei Israel existed, and of course, way before they even went down to Egypt in the first place. So the first stanza is like, there are some words of introduction. I'll read the English. The courage of your wondrous powers you displayed on Pesach. At the head of all festivals, you raised up Pesach. And you revealed yourself to Ezrachi on the midnight of Pesach. Ezrachi is a nickname for Avraham in a Midrashic tradition. And this is based on a tradition that Brit Ben Abtarim happened on the night of Pesach. And then the chorus, and you shall say it, is the Pesach, V'amartem zevach Pesach. And the next two verses are the ones that I find most fascinating. On his door you knocked in the heat of day on Pesach. He prepared a feast of matzot for the fiery angels on Pesach. And to the herd he ran for the ox in memory of the bull order on Pesach. And you shall say it is the Pesach sacrifice. V'amartem zevach Pesach. So who is the person? What is the biblical story that is hinted in this verse? It's the beginning of Parashat Vayera. Avraham, that when Avraham was sitting outside Kechom Hayom, the angels came. And when Avraham says to Sarah, make lushi ugot, kemach solet, really these are matzot, based on a drasha of ugot matzot ki lo chametz in Sefer Shmot. And Sarah is making ugot, and these are ugot matzot. So Avraham and Sarah are eating matzot on Pesach together with the angels that came to visit them. And then the next stanza, the same thing happens with Lot, only there it's even explicit in the Tanakh. So it's easier to make the drasha that he made matzot when the angels came to Lot's house to tell him that God is going to destroy Sodom. He made matzah for them. And so we have Avraham, Sarah, and the angels, and Lot, all eating matzah on Pesach, which means that the holiday of Pesach existed way before Bnei Israel came to be, way before they went down to Egypt, and of course, way before they left Egypt. So this is why, I'm just going to show you here the verses, in Sefer Shmot, ugot matzot ki lo chametz, and in the two stories we have vasi ugot and umatzot afar yochelu. So okay, so this is why this piyut, I call it either a trans-historical perception of Pesach or an ahistorical perception of Pesach. Pesach as a holiday with the mitzvah of matzot, it existed before Bnei Israel existed. It existed before the enslavement in Egypt existed. And then what does this do to the historic element of Pesach? What does this do to Zecher L'Tziat Mitzrayim? In a sense, Pesach is no longer about Zecher L'Tziat Mitzrayim. Pesach sort of exists on its own. And this idea is connected to a broader theme that we have in rabbinic sources, ancient Jewish sources, that the Torah existed before the creation of the world, that all of the Avot observed the Torah. So this is part of a wider tradition. But what happens is that Pesach is the quintessential historic holiday. It's about remembering a historic event. And when we make Pesach ahistoric, when we make Pesach existing before all of this, then it detaches from the historic, from its historic significance, and in the piyut itself. So Yetziat Mitzrayim has one and a half stanzas that are dedicated to Yetziat Mitzrayim. The Mikdash has no presence whatsoever. I'm going to return to this. So you can see that after Sdom, the next stanza is about Makat Bechorot. But then there are other stanzas about Milchemet Midian and about the fall of Bavel, and then Esther on Pesach, and then the Geula is also going to happen on Pesach. So in this piyut, Pesach existed before time, and Pesach will be the moment of Geula, and the Mikdash does not exist in this piyut, and Yetziat Mitzrayim is one chapter of many moments in which Pesach happened. And this is, we can think about this as a mystical way of thinking about Pesach, an apocalyptic way of thinking about Pesach. But I think there's something very strong about thinking about Pesach in this way, because a lot of our Leila Seder is about the lack of Mikdash. We no longer have the Mikdash. And we talk about Korban Pesach, Zecher LaMikdash, and in the Bracha of the Geula, we pray that Hashem will restore the Mikdash and we can toss the blood on the Mizbeach. And then we're sitting in Leila Seder with this big hole, with this big lack. We're lacking the Mikdash. When we think about Pesach in this different way, in this other way, so suddenly we're not lacking anything, and when our celebration of Pesach is another one moment, one instance of Pesach that is like other instances of Pesach. That happened before there was a Mikdash, when Lot gave matzah to the Malachim, and Pesach will also happen in the time of the Geula, and our Leila Seder is one kind of manifestation of Pesach, and we should celebrate it as it is. So, thank you, everyone, and well, you're welcome to ask questions.
Thank you so much for this really wonderful session, and thank you everyone for being here. Before we head out and conclude our Yom Iyun, I wanted to make a quick plug for the remainder of our upcoming Pesach programs, or pre-Pesach programs. This coming Tuesday night at 8 p.m. Eastern, we have an event called Seder Telling that's going to feature 4 different storytellers from the Jewish world retelling the story of the Seder in their own words, going back in some ways to some of the ideas that we've talked about today of the different kinds of texts or the different associations of memory that we may have outside of the text of the Haggadah that we're familiar with. So another opportunity to engage with some of those different interpretations and some of the ways that we might think about telling the story that we're not used to from our regular Seder. Again, that's going to be on Tuesday night at 8 p.m. Eastern. And on Thursday, the 25th at 8 in the morning, Eastern. We have our Tani Bechorot Siyum with Rabbanit Leah Sarna, our Associate Director of Education. She's going to be making her Siyum on Masechet Pesachim, which concludes tomorrow in the Daf Yomi cycle. So for anyone who wants to be present for that Siyum, we invite you to be present with that at 8 a.m. on Thursday. And then after Pesach, we are going to be starting our next series of classes. The theme is going to be perspectives on plague. So during the period of time between Pesach and Shavuot, we will have 8 new classes running, dealing with a number of different perspectives, historical, theological, and more related to the idea of plague, as well as a few things specifically related to COVID-19 and what we have been experiencing for the past year. Information on all of those classes, both our pre and post-Pesach offerings, is on our website at drisha.org/classes. And you can also feel free to email me at fraud@drisha.org if you have any questions. But again, thank you so much to both of our teachers today for really, really wonderful material, sending us into Pesach and into Leil HaSeder with really great new perspectives. And thank you so much to all of you for being here. Chag Kasher V'Sameach, and we hope to see you again soon.